Hi, hope you're doing well today. A few of you have been asking about our 10 o'clock service and if and when we're going to be restarting that. We haven't got any firm plans at the moment, but it is a discussion we're starting to have. We are making sure at the moment that we are fully up to date with what all the rules and regulations say. And when we have that clear, we will be in touch to try and discern how many of our church community would feel able to take part in a 10 o'clock service that complies with the restrictions that are upon us at the moment. So stay tuned and we'll keep you informed about that as we know more. We're continuing this morning in looking at the series of signs in John's Gospel. And remember that these signs, the miracles that Jesus is recorded as performing in John's Gospel, are there to show us who Jesus is. They are factual events that we believe happened, that are part of the historical record of what we know about Jesus, but they also tell us something fundamental about the God we worship and about Jesus whom we serve. And this morning we're looking at John chapter 9, the healing of the man who was blind from birth. Jesus and the disciples are walking along and they come across this man who was well known in the community. He was known to be blind from birth. And as they do so, they start a conversation with Jesus about him and say, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that caused him to be born blind?" They start with an assumption. And Jesus' response is to completely disarm them. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And as soon as he'd finished talking, having referred to himself as the light of the world, Jesus spits on the ground, makes some mud with the saliva, puts it on the man's eyes, sends him off to wash in a pool not so far away. And when the man went and washed and came back, he was able to see for the first time in his life. And this provokes a reaction in the community around him. He would, of course, been well known in the community as the man who had been blind from birth and who had had to rely on the generosity of others, who begged for his food and begged for money in order to live on. And now he is a transformed person. And some of them say, "This is the man who used to sit and beg." But others say, no, it can't be. It just must be someone who looks a bit like him. But the man insists that it's him. And they ask him how his eyes were opened, and he says, well, the man called Jesus put some mud on my eyes, and so on. But Jesus can't be found at this stage. So they bring the Pharisees into the situation. And the issue is now that this was the Sabbath. And the Pharisees ask the same question: how are you able to see again? And the man explains. And the Pharisees, well, some of the Pharisees say, well, this can't be from God. This man can't be doing God's will because he's working on the Sabbath. And we know it's not God's will to work on the Sabbath. But some of the other Pharisees are saying, look at what he's done. He's made this man see. How can he not be a man from God? And so they ask the man who's been healed. And he says, well, this man is a prophet. And they still don't know what to do. So they talk to the parents. And the parents say, well, he's our son, and we know he's been blind from birth, and now he can see. Let him speak for himself. So again, they get the man to come to him. They ask him what Jesus did. And the man says, well, I've already told you. They start to insult him and say, you're his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we don't know anything about this guy. And then Jesus hears that this man has been thrown out, has been bullied by some of these Pharisees. And Jesus, before the man realizes who he is, says, do you believe in the Son of Man? A title that Jesus often used for himself. And the man says, well, where is he? Jesus says, well, that's me. And the man believes in him. And Jesus then replies, well, I've come into this world for judgment, so that the blind will see and that those who see will become blind. The Pharisees take offense at this. You're saying we're blind? Jesus' reply is, well, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. So it's a sign that tells us about the judgments and assumptions that we make about ourselves, about others, and it also tells us something of who Jesus really is. The first thing to notice here is that the gossip and the undermining of the man's integrity, the man who is healed in this story, the man who's been blind from birth, that gossip and that undermining, that bullying, does not start with the Pharisees, although it spreads to them very quickly. It starts with the disciples of Jesus. They are the ones who make an assumption first. Did he sin or did his parents sin? And then it ripples out to the man's community and then to the Pharisees. The gossip spreads outward, started by the questioning and the undermining and the assumptions made by the disciples. And they only have two categories. It's a very binary situation the disciples are thinking in. Well, either the man must have done something wrong or his parents must have done something wrong. And that's the assumption that's been made by some in the community and by some of the Pharisees as well. They say it is an either or. There's no shades of grey here. The gossip starts to spread. It goes from disciples to community to religious authorities. And as it spreads to the community, it reminded me a bit of kind of the overtones of what Jesus himself experienced. Can any good come out of Nazareth? And a prophet is without honour in his hometown. Those sort of things that we know from other parts of the Gospel's accounts of Jesus' life. And by the time that gossip has spread to the religious authorities, it's the Sabbath, the fact that this all happens on the Sabbath when people are meant to be resting, gives a pretext to expose the insecurity that comes about as a result of the change in the man and the work of Jesus. Because it's not really about the Sabbath, it's about the fact that Jesus isn't operating in this binary worldview that the disciples and the Pharisees and the community have of either the man sinning or the parents sinning. But Jesus doesn't fit into that. It's not about who sinned, it's about my work, it's about the work of God, it's about the work of the glory of God being revealed in me and through me and in this man's life. It's not about who sinned. What we read in verse 16, as the Pharisees say this man is not from God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath, is a worldview, a way of viewing God and religion, which is echoing, remember, what the community and what the disciples have started to say, that if you don't see God and faith the way we do, then you can't be from God. Let me say that again. If you don't see God and faith the way we do, then you can't be from God. As I said earlier, it's a very binary, either or, black and white way of looking at life and faith. But what Jesus says, when he says in verse 3 that neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him, what Jesus is revealing is that it's about mercy. The life of faith is about mercy, about seeing God for who he is, and not adherence to a system or fitting into a worldview that works for one and not the other. The reason the disciples and the community and the Pharisees fall into this trap is because they have constructed for themselves a way of thinking about life and faith that works for them and keeps them safe and makes them feel better about themselves and excludes others, pushes others to the side, because they must have done something wrong because they don't see faith the way we do. The key to the sign that is going on in this chapter, as Jesus says in verse 39, is that he has come to bring judgment to the world so that the blind will see and those who see will become blind, which is an undermining of what's already going in, because the disciples are seeking to judge, the community are seeking to judge, the Pharisees are seeking to judge, and Jesus is coming and saying, no, that's my place. That's my place to judge. But actually, this is a judge who is defined by the mercy which he shows. And in saying this, in saying that these signs and that his ministry as a whole is about showing who is blind and who can see, there is an echo there of the reason Jesus says elsewhere in the Gospels that he talks in parables, that they reveal something about who we truly are. And that the really important thing about our life is not about the outward signs and systems and ideas that we have, but it's about the inward realities of our hearts, about lives that, like the man who's healed in this passage, display the works of God. See, this blindness that the man is healed from is really about the whole of his life. And this sign is an outward sign of an inward reality. It's about a person discovering and seeing afresh, not only with his physical eyes, but with his spiritual eyes, if you like, with the eyes of his heart, seeing afresh who he really is and who God really is, and worshipping him. This man's identity is transformed. He's not the one who begs anymore. So transformed is he that some around don't recognize him anymore. Some of us have categories for people, and sometimes we have no category for those people changing. We always, to take a slightly silly example perhaps, if we've known somebody since they were very young, there is a part of us that always thinks of that person as very young, despite the fact that they may have grown up by 10 or 20 or 30 years. And part of that is natural and human, but it is an echo, a hint of that idea that we don't often have a category for people fundamentally changing. I was chatting with Philip Donald, a member of Peters this week, and we were chatting about this idea, and he was telling me that in the field of psychology, there's an idea called the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error. When something goes wrong for somebody else, this idea says, our tendency as onlookers is to look for blame in the person to whom it's happened. When something goes wrong with us, it's very often our tendency to blame our circumstances. Different cultures and different communities and different people, of course, have different levels and variations on this. See, we always want someone to blame. And usually we like to think it's their fault, but not mine, when something goes wrong for somebody else and then for us. And what it seems to me is this fundamental attribution error is an echo of our gravitational pull to what we think of as the gospel of salvation by works, that false religion, that heresy that is so attractive to us, that makes us think we can earn stuff from life and from God, and that we can deserve stuff from life and from God. And if something has gone wrong for somebody else, well, then it must be their fault. And if something has gone wrong for me, there must be something I can do to fix it, because it's just the fault of circumstances. But this sign of the man who's been born blind being healed shows us that, as in Jesus' response to the questions from the disciples and the communities and the Pharisees, it shows us that this gravitational pull towards earning stuff is false and unhealthy and dangerous, and that really we are shaped for grace, and that we exist for the glory of God, and that what happens is not so much about our fault or the fault of somebody else, but it's asking, what is God doing here? What is God making clear in us and through us and around us? It's not about fault or credit. It's not about our works. It's not a reward for our holiness or a punishment for our lack of holiness. It's about what God is doing how God is showing his glory in us. It doesn't mean we don't make mistakes. And it doesn't mean, of course, that we don't live with the consequences often of those mistakes. And it doesn't mean that we don't try with God's help and support of others to live better lives that we might think are more appropriate for those who follow Jesus. But what this means, as we learn from a sign like this, that God is a God of grace, who doesn't punish us as our sins deserve, and doesn't reward us according to our efforts. What this shows us is that we can be gentler on ourselves. We don't have to flog ourselves and work ourselves to the bone to prove ourselves to God or to others or to ourselves. Because it's about what God does through us, in us. We can let ourselves go a bit. By that I mean we can cut ourselves some slack. It's not the end of the world if we make some mistakes. Not that we try to make mistakes, but we just relax. We don't have to get it all right all the time. We can be gentler on ourselves. We can be realistic about our capacities and our capabilities. As well as being gentler and more realistic on ourselves, we can also be gentler and more willing to assume the best about others. What's going wrong in somebody's life may not be their fault. We don't have, any of us, all the facts about other people. It's easy for some of us to assume the worst about a situation or a relationship or a person, particularly if you're like me, if you're not in much contact with a person, and there's a lot of that around at the moment, obviously because of lockdown and so on, and we don't see each other face to face, we can't always work stuff out. So how tempting is it if to assume the worst and to think somebody is offended by us or angry with us? Our children, like all of us, use WhatsApp a lot, and sometimes they complain about people blue ticking them, by which they mean they can see the 2 blue ticks on the message they've sent to their mates, and that tells them that their mates have read the message that's been sent. And they say, well, why hasn't he replied? Why hasn't she replied? And the assumption is there's a problem if they haven't replied. But there could be any reason why they haven't replied. Maybe they don't need to reply. Maybe they're doing something else. Maybe they kind of glanced at the phone and then put it down because they got distracted. It could be any number of reasons. Of course, we adults never do anything like that, do we? Maybe we do. It's so easy to assume what others think about us, and so easy to assume the reasons for things happening in other people's lives. And this sign, which reveals Jesus to be a Jesus of grace and mercy, enables us to be gentler on ourselves and to be gentler and to be more willing to assume the best about others. So we don't have the facts. We don't know everything. Maybe what's going on, what's going wrong isn't their fault. Let's let God deal with it. Maybe I can help that person, support that person. The signs show Jesus to be a Jesus of grace. How much we need that. We know how much we need God to be the God who doesn't treat us as we deserve. He treats us so much better than we deserve. I think this sign is an invitation to us to move out of these binary assumptions about our own lives and the lives of other people, about punishment or reward, about fault and blame, and towards a more holistic, God-centered view of life and of others and of ourselves that says we all make mistakes, we all mess up, but what's important is what God does in us and through us. And then we have a God who is so well accustomed and practiced in working in and through the problems and the crises and the mistakes. We can't pretend, really, at the end of the day, to have full understanding of why some things happen. I mean, why they happen on the spiritual level. I can't, at the end of the day, really spiritually explain the pandemic or an individual tragedy in our lives. I can't really understand that at the end of the day. But what I can come to terms with is this idea that they're neither punishments nor rewards. They're not punishments for my mistakes. And the good things that happen, they aren't really rewards for me doing well. But I can look at these situations and say, well, what is God doing? What's God doing in me, and what's God doing around us? What grace is Jesus showing us? What grace is God exercising? Or what grace am I being called to exercise to others and to myself? We need grace. You need grace, I need grace. And our community needs grace. Let us be those who show grace to others and grace to ourselves, as Jesus has shown it to us.